We have huge volumes of sediment that have been removed by massive amounts of erosion, we believe, after the entire sequence was deposited. Now, we refer to that, Caleb, oftentimes as sheet erosion or denudation, where a massive amount of material was removed. And if you think about it, it's exactly the kind of thing we would see from a global flood. During the flood, I mean, we have the initial stages of depositing some of the sediments at the Grand Canyon. We kind of have two different models, as we talked about last week or last time, of either millions of years of slow, gradual advances and retreats of oceans that slowly deposited up layers over the course of millions of years, or a massive amount of erosion from different places around the world and more sediment being brought into the landscape as the floodwaters propelled, sediment and fossils and things like that all over across the continents. And so kind of two different models, but what we see at the Grand Canyon is really only kind of a small snapshot, if you will, of what we believe was deposited during this year-long flood. When you go and look around the region, we have, especially up towards the north, what we call the Grand Staircase. And so the Grand Staircase is really, there's multiple other layers that were deposited on top of the rim rock of the Grand Canyon, which is the Kaibab limestone. So kind of here, which if you look at this picture, this is not necessarily to scale, but you can see, the Grand Canyon, those layers that basically go up to the Kaibab limestone. And then as you go up towards the north, you encounter up into Utah, parks like Zion National Park, Bryce Canyon National Park, all the way up towards Cedar Breaks, where you actually encounter multiple other layers of sediment that were deposited on top of what we see at the Grand Canyon. Now, when we look at the Grand Canyon, we're only looking, we're looking a mile deep, but most people don't realize we are missing an entire package of rocks on top of the canyon. We are missing a vast majority. In fact, more layers are missing from above the Grand Canyon than what we see within the Grand Canyon itself.
Yeah.
We have huge volumes of sediment that have been removed by massive amounts of erosion, we believe, after the entire sequence was deposited. Now, we refer to that, Caleb, oftentimes as sheet erosion or denudation, where a massive amount of material was removed. And if you think about it, it's exactly the kind of thing we would see from a global flood. If we had water that brought in sediment and was covering the entire world, as the Bible describes, as that water then receded and retreated off the continents, it would drag with it all kinds of sand and debris, all kinds of freshly laid soft mud and sediment, kind of in a very similar way that we actually see and observe if you go to the beach. You see a wave rises up against, and it brings in some seashells and some sand. But as that wave on the beach retreats, you can see it drags with it sand and seashells and debris back down. It pulls it back off the land. Yeah. And the very same thing would happen with a global flood. As the waters are receding off the continents, it would also be removing and eroding some of that material that it had just previously laid down during the buildup stage, you might say, of the flood. We have this retreating stage of the flood, which takes place likely from day 150 onwards during the flood, as the floodwaters then begin to recede, the Bible describes in Genesis chapter 8. We see this recession of stuff, and we see what we call sheet erosion, as the water is acting as one big giant sheet and pulling material off the continents. Right. And it removes roughly, 6,000 to 8,000 feet perhaps of material off the top of the Grand Canyon sedimentary layers. All these layers of the Grand Staircase are now pulled away in certain regions, like we see at the Grand Canyon. We're missing, a mile and a half, you might say, of sediment that should have been on top of the Grand Canyon, but is no longer there.
Wow. So what's the secular model to explain what happened with all of these layers that were eroded off in the Grand Staircase?
So when it comes to the Grand Staircase removal, there's not a lot of stuff you're going to find in the national park. So if you go to the Grand Canyon, you're not really going to see a lot mentioned or talked about it. And I have yet to find a satisfactory model that I would even find, from a different perspective of that, because it's just not talked about. Not only are we missing that material from the top of the Grand Canyon, but that material is not even found in the surrounding, desert landscape, you might say. It hasn't just been removed from the Grand Canyon, it's been removed from the continent. And we find, I believe, some of that material off the coast of the continent. Like you go down to the Gulf of Texas there, looking out there, and you can find, hundreds of miles out there, we have things like the Whopper Sand, which is a massive, sand and sandstone formation that's been basically just tremendous amount of surface material off the continents has been dumped far out there. And so it's an incredible, I believe, an incredible testimony of a massive amount of water receding and retreating off the continents.
Wow. We have an interesting comment related to that here from Fincer for Jesus. He says, the secular model has the same mechanism, but they have rising and falling seas for each layer, but no sheet erosion until the last one. Now, that's interesting because if what he's saying is on point here, it seems that it must have been a catastrophic erosion. But in their model, if they have the rising and falling seas, like we talked about in part one, it seems like you shouldn't find the all of the rest of the sediments as far away as we do.
Yeah, I mean, that would require a sheet erosion process too, a catastrophic process.
Yeah, catastrophic is key.
Catastrophism is not something that you typically see oftentimes utilized in the standard geological models. It's just, they avoid that oftentimes. Now, they do talk about periods of, punctuated catastrophism and things like that. But by and large, we oftentimes talk about slow processes.